Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
I want you to close your eyes for a second and just picture a winter that is so bitterly, bone-chillingly cold that a major American river, the Susquehanna, freezes entirely solid.
And I don't mean a thin, delicate sheet of skating rink ice either.
No, exactly. I am talking about an absolute deep freeze, like ice reaching a depth of 2 solid feet, bank to bank.
Right, which is just massive.
It is early 1904, and the local merchants in Pennsylvania are looking at this frozen expanse, and, they're treating it literally as a highway.
Just driving right over it?
Yeah. They are driving these massive, heavy, horse-drawn freight wagons loaded to the brim with tobacco right across the ice.
Wow.
Just traveling back and forth between Lancaster and York counties as casually as if they were on a paved turnpike.
I mean, if you were standing there, it would look incredibly serene.
A picturesque winter wonderland, right?
Yeah.
Just humanity adapting perfectly to its environment.
Yeah, but here is the terrifying thing about nature. It doesn't stay frozen forever.
No, it really doesn't, because spring arrives, the temperatures creep up, the heavy spring rains begin to fall, and that 2-foot-thick, rock-solid highway suddenly fractures.
It just shatters.
It turns into this chaotic, unstoppable weapon of nature that will literally scour entire towns off the map.
It is a profound, violent transformation. We are so conditioned to think of rivers as these life-giving, gentle forces, or, at worst, as slowly rising floodwaters that give you time to move your furniture to the second floor.
Right, like you have a day to pack a bag.
Exactly. But what happened here was entirely different. It was instantaneous, it was kinetic, and it completely rewrote the geographical reality of the region in just a matter of minutes.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack an event known as the Great Ice Flood of 1904.
Which is such a fascinating topic.
It really is, because if you know anything about weather history in this part of the country, you've probably heard of Tropical Storm Agnes.
Oh, for sure. People still talk about Agnes as the ultimate benchmark for destruction.
They do. But historians and the historical records we are looking at today say that what happened in 1904 far exceeded the devastation of Agnes.
By a long shot.
We are going to look at exactly how a frozen river essentially declared war on human infrastructure.
And we have an incredibly rich foundation of material to guide us today, too.
We really do.
If you look back at the original reporting from that week in March 1904, the journalists on the ground were writing dispatches that almost sound fictional today.
They read like a disaster movie script.
Totally. We are pulling directly from those real-time panicked accounts in the Lancaster New Era and the Enquirer.
Published literally days after the disaster.
Right. And we're looking at those alongside a much more recent 2018 retrospective and detailed historical analyses from the Susquehanna National Heritage Area.
Which is so helpful, because looking at the raw, immediate terror of 1904 through the lens of modern historical synthesis, it just gives us a crystal clear picture of how bad things really got.
It really does.
And the reason we are bringing this to you, the listener, why you should really care about a flood that happened over a century ago, is because this isn't just a story about a bizarre weather anomaly.
No, not at all.
This is a stark, almost theatrical lesson in the unpredictable physics of nature colliding head-on with a booming era of human engineering.
Yes.
It is a story about the absolute hubris of the early 20th century.
That is the perfect way to frame it. The early 1900s was an era where humanity was feeling pretty invincible.
We really were.
We were mastering electricity, we were building these massive steel and stone structures, and we were convinced we could tame any landscape.
But nature has a very specific way of reminding us who is actually in charge.
Exactly. And it usually uses the raw laws of physics to deliver that message.
Okay, so let's set the scene and talk about that exact human hubris. It is early 1904. This region along the Susquehanna is experiencing an era of massive, explosive industrial expansion.
It was booming.
People are practically high on the fumes of the Industrial Revolution. And right at this moment, you have 3 iconic, monumental construction projects happening simultaneously in these 2 counties.
Which is wild to think about. First, you have the York Haven Hydroelectric Dam.
Right.
And this wasn't just another small-town water wheel either. It was one of the very first major hydroelectric projects on the lower river.
It was huge.
Engineers were putting the finishing touches on this multi-million-dollar marvel designed specifically to harness the river's raw power.
Which was cutting-edge technology at the time.
Absolutely. Second, you have the Pennsylvania Railroad edging its low-grade line right along the riverbanks on the Lancaster County side.
Just blasting through rocks.
Blasting through rock, laying down tracks to conquer the uneven terrain.
Yeah.
And third, you have the soaring Shocks Mill Railroad Bridge.
Which is just a massive, heavy stone structure rising high above the water to connect the two counties.
Stone, steel, electricity.
The holy trinity of human progress. They must have looked at that frozen river and thought, look at us, we have tamed you.
Oh, they definitely thought that.
We are building our stone arches over you. We are extracting your power for our cities. We are driving our wagons right across your frozen face.
It was a supreme display of confidence. I mean, the engineers of 1904 were building structures they believed were entirely permanent.
Untouchable.
Right. They were designing for the predictable behavior of water, treating the river as a solved equation.
Okay, let's unpack this right there because I'm trying to picture the sheer mechanics of this.
Sure.
If an engineer designs a stone bridge or a massive hydroelectric dam, they are obviously building it to withstand spring floods.
Right, of course.
It's built in a river. It is literally designed to handle rushing water. So why doesn't it hold up to the ice?
That's the million-dollar question.
Isn't ice just, lighter floating water? What is the actual science of the threat here that these brilliant engineers were completely underestimating?
Well, that is exactly what the engineers thought. And that is the fatal flaw in their logic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. To understand why, we have to look at the thermodynamics of ice formation and the fluid dynamics of what happens during a thaw.
Okay.
So the historical records from the heritage area distinguish between two very different phenomena. You have freeze-up jams and you have break-up jams.
What's the difference?
A freeze-up jam happens in early to midwinter. The water is flowing, the surface ice starts to form, it hits an obstruction, and it slows down, basically clumping together.
Like a slow traffic jam as the lanes merge on a highway.
Exactly like that. It kind of is localized flooding, sure, but it's generally a slower, more manageable process.
Okay, so what was 1904?
1904 was not a freeze-up jam. It was the far more destructive, exponentially more violent breakup jam.
A breakup jam.
Here's the underlying mechanism of how it works. You have this incredibly thick, solid 2-foot ice cover that's been sitting there all winter.
Like the highway for the tobacco wagons.
Yes. It is essentially a massive, rigid lid on top of the river. Then you get a late winter thaw. The temperatures spike unexpectedly.
Spring arrives early.
Right. Then comes the heavy spring rain. All that warm rain hits the accumulated snow on the surrounding hills and mountains, melting it incredibly rapidly.
So you suddenly have millions of gallons of runoff water rushing down into the river basin from every possible direction all at once.
Exactly. The river begins to swell beneath the ice.
Because it's a basin.
Right. But remember, that 2-foot thick ice sheet is acting like a sealed lid. The river's filling up, but the water has nowhere to expand.
It's trapped.
Completely trapped. And this creates an unfathomable amount of hydrostatic pressure.
Okay, let's break down hydrostatic pressure for a second. If I'm standing on the bank in 1904 watching this, what exactly is happening under the water to create that kind of force?
Think of hydrostatic pressure as the pressure exerted by a fluid at equilibrium at a given point within the fluid, just due to the force of gravity.
Okay, right.
In simpler terms, water is heavy, and it cannot be compressed.
You can't squeeze water into a smaller box.
Exactly. So when you force massive new volumes of water into a confined space, in this case, the riverbed trapped beneath a thick sheet of ice, that water exerts immense equal pressure in all directions, trying to find an escape.
And the bottom is rock.
Right. Because the bedrock below won't budge and the banks on the sides won't budge, the only place for that kinetic energy to go is up.
Up. So the rise in water is physically pushing upward against millions of tons of solid ice.
Yes. And eventually, the upward hydrostatic pressure overcomes the structural integrity of the ice.
It breaks the lid.
It shatters it. The rising water physically lifts and shatters that heavy ice cover into millions of massive, floating, jagged chunks.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't melt, you see. It shatters. And then the raging current grabs those frozen house-sized chunks and just hurls them downstream.
Reading through the original reporting, I couldn't help but picture it like a clogged artery in the human body.
That's a good comparison.
But instead of soft cholesterol slowly building up over decades, it's millions of tons of jagged, rock-hard ice chunks.
Right.
The river is the artery, and the water is the blood pumping furiously behind it. But the ice chunks hit the narrow spaces, the river bends, the shallow points, and they instantly choke the river completely.
Exactly.
They clump together, they freeze to one another, and they form a rigid, solid dam, an ice gorge. And behind that gorge, the water and the remaining ice just keep building, creating a fatal bottleneck.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. And just like a blocked artery, the pressure behind the blockage builds to a point that the system simply cannot survive.
It has to burst.
Right. And this brings us back to your question about why the engineers' dams and bridges failed.
Because they didn't account for the artery bursting.
Precisely. A hydroelectric dam is designed to handle hydraulic flow. That's just water passing through its turbines or over its spillways.
Fluid dynamics.
Right. And a stone arch bridge is designed with immense compressive strength. The weight of the stone and the trains running over it pushes down, locking the stones together.
So gravity is actually holding the bridge together.
Yes, exactly. It is brilliant for bearing downward weight. But neither of those structures is designed to withstand lateral kinetic impacts.
Meaning things hitting it from the side.
Right. Millions of tons of solid ice slamming horizontally into the side of the structure like a battering ram. And they certainly aren't designed for upward lift.
Because gravity only works one way.
Exactly. When an ice gorge forms against a bridge, the hydrostatic pressure we talked about earlier builds up behind it, forcing the ice and water upward.
Wow.
The stone arches have absolutely zero defense against being pushed up from the bottom.
Which means the very physics that make the bridge strong are completely bypassed.
They are rendered useless.
And the crazy thing is, nature had offered them warnings. I mean, the engineers should have known.
They really should have.
If you look back at the records, in 1832, during another extremely cold winter, a spring thaw triggered an ice jam that raised the river by 30 feet.
30 feet is just astronomical.
Right. It took out the very first bridge that spanned the Susquehanna, the longest covered bridge in the world at the time, connecting Columbia and Wrightsville.
It just lifted the whole thing right off its piers.
You would think 1832 would have been the ultimate cautionary tale for these guys.
They certainly knew it was a historical possibility, but, human memory is short.
Yeah, that's true.
And the sheer unprecedented scale of the 1904 buildup was something their models just couldn't predict.
Which brings us to the actual catalyst. It is early March 1904.
The thaw begins.
Right. By March 4th, the local papers are already devoting massive panicked headlines to rising waters and the formation of these early ice gorges.
The spring rains have come.
The ice begins to break up and move. And honestly, reading the accounts of the initial human reaction is almost comical in its innocence.
Oh, it really is.
It's treated as a spectacle. The journalists noted that the townsfolk from the surrounding cities of York and Lancaster literally emptied out.
Just dropped everything.
Thousands of people took trains or walked to the riverbanks just to watch the, quote, great sight. It was like a 1904 blockbuster movie.
It speaks to how drawn humans are to the sublime, to the terrifying beauty of nature.
Like storm chasers.
Exactly. If you try to imagine the sensory experience of that day, it must have been hypnotic. The deafening sound, the cracking, grinding, and booming of 2-foot-thick ice fracturing for miles. It would have echoed through the valley like artillery fire.
That's terrifying.
But the situation deteriorated with a speed that is almost hard to comprehend. As you mentioned with your clogged artery analogy, these great ice flows marched down the river, but they couldn't keep moving forever.
Right, they hit snags.
They hit snags, they hit shallow points. And when they did, they instantly dammed the river.
And when we say instantly, we are not using hyperbole. I want you, the listener, to hear this terrifying statistic from the historical record because it fundamentally changes how you understand water.
It really does.
In some places along the river, the water level rose 10 feet in just 5 minutes.
Just let that sink in.
10 feet.
Yeah.
5 minutes. Try to even process the fluid dynamics of that. If you are standing on the riverbank watching the spectacle in your winter coat and the water is at your ankles, 5 minutes later, it is 3 feet over your head.
You don't have time to pack a bag.
You don't have time to save your belongings. You barely have time to sprint for high ground.
It completely defies our normal, everyday understanding of how water behaves. We think of floods as creeping up the steps over hours or maybe days.
Exactly.
But this was a vertical wall. And this rapid, violent displacement of water and ice brings us to the first major casualty of the 1904 flood.
Right.
the little village of Collins in Connie Township.
Poor Collins. This part of the record honestly gave me chills because it introduces us to the sheer, unadulterated violence of the event.
It was devastating.
Collins wasn't just a few shacks. It had a train station, it had a hotel, it had sturdy old canal lock houses. It was a functioning, living little village.
And then the ice gorge hit it.
Right.
The description from the contemporary reports is just haunting. 5 old canal lock houses were physically picked up and crashed into each other by the ice.
They were used as weapons against each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the train station wasn't just flooded. The reports specifically used the phrase, ground away.
Ground away. I mean, think about the friction and the unimaginable weight required to grind a solid wood and brick building into literal nothingness.
It's pulverizing.
I found myself thinking as I read this, we really shouldn't even use the word flooding for this.
No, it's inadequate.
Flooding is when water goes where it shouldn't, ruins the drywall, warps the floorboards, and then slowly recedes, leaving a foot of mud behind. This wasn't a flood. This was geographical erasure.
Geographical erasure is a vital distinction because the ice blocks were acting like nature's bulldozers. When an ice gorge moves, you have thousands of tons of jagged, hardened ice being pushed by the unstoppable force of the river behind it. They weren't just flowing over the land. They were scraping it down to the bedrock.
The village of Collins was scoured off the earth forever.
Just gone.
The only thing left standing in the entire town was the top half of a train control tower. And even that had been physically shoved 5 feet off its solid stone foundation by the sheer kinetic force of the ice impact.
It is mind-boggling. And the terrifying thing is, the erasure of Collins was just the opening act.
Right, because this introduces the terrifying cause and effect reality of the entire disaster. The destruction wasn't happening all at once, everywhere. It was a domino effect moving downriver.
Exactly. When an ice gorge forms, it acts as a temporary dam, holding back an unimaginable volume of water.
Building up that hydrostatic pressure.
Right. But remember, eventually the water pressure overcomes the structural integrity of the ice dam.
And it breaks.
When that gorge finally breaks, it doesn't just return to a normal river flow. It releases all that pent-up water, plus the massive volume of ice that made up the gorge itself.
It adds all that mass to the wave.
Yes, and it sends this even larger, more violent wall of water and ice hurtling down to the next narrow point, the next bottleneck.
It's literally a conveyor belt of destruction moving south. You break one dam, the wave gathers more momentum, more mass, more debris, and slams into the next natural bottleneck.
And as it moves south, it absolutely wreaks havoc on that booming industrial infrastructure we talked about earlier.
The financial hits are staggering when you look at the raw numbers. I mean, we talked about the York Haven power plant.
Right, the brand new one.
Wait, you're saying the York Haven power plant collapsed? But wasn't it a hydroelectric dam?
It was.
It was literally built in the river to withstand the force of the river. How does the very thing it's designed to process destroy it?
It goes back to what we discussed about hydraulic flow versus kinetic impact. The York Haven Dam was a brilliant piece of engineering for processing liquid water.
Fluid dynamics.
Right. The spillways allow water to pass over, and the turbines use the flow to generate electricity.
Yeah.
But when a 30-foot wall of jagged, solid ice chunks slams into the superstructure...
It's a completely different physics equation.
Exactly. It's no longer dealing with fluid dynamics. It's dealing with blunt force trauma.
Wow.
The ice battered the brand new $2 million facility. The superstructure of the building was completely collapsed by the crushing weight.
The one they were just putting the finishing touches on.
The very same.
And the immense paper mill located at the same place. Battered and severely damaged. I mean, $2 million in 1904 money is an astronomical loss.
It's crippled.
It proved that their steel and their stone were absolutely no match for millions of tons of ice in motion.
And as this massive destruction moved, the river began to act as a bizarre, chaotic conveyor belt, creating some of the most surreal visuals you could possibly imagine.
Oh, to really make this memorable for you, the listener, you have to picture what the locals were witnessing from the safety of the hills.
It's wild.
In the town of Bainbridge, the brand new railroad station was completely dislodged from its foundation. But it didn't just smash to pieces immediately. It floated a mile down the railroad tracks.
Imagine seeing that.
Imagine looking out your window and seeing the local train station casually drifting down the tracks like a phantom train.
It sounds made up.
And it gets weirder. In Marietta, a stunned family stood on the high ground watching the icy water, and what do they see bobbing by?
What did they see?
Tobacco sheds from their own family farm miles upriver on what is now 3 Mile Island.
No way.
Yes, just drifting past them in the ice, perfectly intact before being crushed.
It sounds absurd, but it speaks to the immense buoyancy of the ice and the sheer undisturbed volume of the water carrying these massive structures so effortlessly.
Because they're basically just big wooden boxes.
Right, a wooden structure is largely hollow and full of air. When the water rises fast enough to lift it gently off its foundation, rather than battering it to pieces right away, it simply becomes a very large boat.
Floating until it hits something hard.
Exactly. But while Marietta was watching tobacco sheds float by, further south in the major hub of Columbia, the situation was turning into an agonizing psychological waiting game.
The threat to Columbia, it sounds like pure psychological torture.
It really was. For 4 solid days, the people of Columbia waited, trembling and hoping against hope.
4 days of watching the river rise.
Yeah. Thousands of people gathered again on the high banks because, humans are morbidly drawn to impending doom.
We can't look away.
We can't. They gathered to watch a massive ice gorge that had piled up to within a foot or two of their mile-long steel railroad bridge.
Oh, man.
They were looking at a literal mountain of stored-up kinetic energy, just waiting for it to give way.
And while they are watching this mountain of ice threaten their beloved bridge, a parade of destruction is flowing right past them in the open channel.
Just a constant stream of debris.
All day Tuesday, millions of tons of house-sized ice blocks are rushing by. The journalists on the ground listed exactly what was coming down the river. Houses, barns, straw stacks.
Everything from upstream.
A massive barn came down the stream, couldn't fit under the clearance of the steel bridge safely, and was severely broken into splinters.
Wow.
They saw smaller outbuildings float by that were entirely full of live chickens and turkeys.
That's heartbreaking.
An entire wooden bridge from somewhere upriver came rushing down, smashed into the steel railroad bridge, and just got tangled up and stuck there.
It's the horrific accumulation of debris. Every town's loss becomes the next town's hazard. You have trees, telegraph poles, barns, and bridges all tangling together in this freezing, churning matrix.
Making the gorge even stronger and more dangerous.
Exactly.
At the foot of Walnut Street in Columbia, the large, beautiful boathouse of the Columbia Canoe Club was washed away and literally spun completely around by the eddies.
Just destroyed.
You are watching your town's recreational heart just get twisted like a bath toy.
But the tension finally broke. The gorge at Columbia gave way on Monday night.
And the domino falls again.
Yes. And it sent that massive, compounded accumulation of ice and water further south straight into Washington Borough.
Or Little Washington, as the locals called it.
Right. And Washington Borough experienced an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
When the gorge broke, it sent a mass down the river that was almost biblical in its proportions.
What did it look like?
The historical accounts describe a landscape that is difficult to even fathom. The river in front of the borough was packed with an ice gorge that was at least 75 feet high.
75 feet. Let's just visualize that for a second. That is a 7-story building made of jagged, grinding, dirty ice blocks, jutting out into the river in a massive V shape, almost entirely to the York County shore.
It's massive. And to put that height in perspective, the local railroad tracks, which normally sat 20 feet above the low water mark, were completely hidden under mountains of ice that were 30 feet deep.
Just buried.
So the river had obtained a total height of about 50 feet above normal at Turkey Hill. The rising water displaced by the 75-foot ice dam flooded a huge portion of the town. The water stood 12 feet deep on the main turnpike.
12 feet deep on a road. That means it reached the second story of houses. There was a house occupied by a man named Christian Hines that had stood on the riverside of Front Street for 110 years.
Over a century.
For over a century, through every single spring thaw and heavy rain, that house was perfectly safe. Tuesday was the very first time the water ever reached it.
That shows you just how unprecedented this was.
It really does. And my favorite, almost tragicomic detail from the original reporting, F.G. Charles's local store was flooded so badly that all the post office business had to be transacted by boat.
By boat.
You literally have the town postmaster rowing a small skiff through the streets to hand out the mail. It is absurd, and yet it shows how desperate people were to maintain some sense of normalcy.
And yet, as devastating as Washington Borough was, the water and ice were still not finished.
It kept moving.
The mass was still moving south, seeking the path of least resistance. It bore down on the gorge at Safe Harbor and Safe Harbor stubbornly resisted.
But when that resistance finally failed, we reach what is arguably the apex of the tragedy. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's set up the village of Safe Harbor, because this wasn't just a sleepy little hamlet that happened to be in the way.
Not at all. Providing the context from the Heritage Area Analysis, Safe Harbor was a booming, highly profitable mid-1800s ironworks town.
Okay, so a lot of industry.
Yes. It was built specifically for the workers and their families who fueled the massive ironworks on the grounds. It was an impressive, sprawling operation spread out through the valley, complete with a roaring blast furnace and a rolling mill.
It sounds like a mini-city.
It brought that entire section of the Conestoga and Susquehanna rivers to life with industry.
It was a completely self-contained world. It had a school, a cemetery, a church. But the detail that tells you exactly what kind of town this was is the nightlife.
Oh, yes.
For a town of about 1,000 people at its peak, Safe Harbor boasted 5 taverns, 3 liquor stores, and 6 beer halls.
That is a lot of alcohol for 1,000 people.
As the historical analysis notes, it was one of the booziest places in terms of its size in the entire country at that time.
I believe it.
Hardworking iron men blowing off steam after working the furnaces. It was a lively, bustling, very human place.
And its specific geography, nestled right in the valley where the Conestoga River discharges into the Susquehanna, is exactly what doomed it.
Why is that?
Here is the precise, fluid, dynamic mechanism of its destruction. Because understanding why Safe Harbor was hit the hardest is a masterclass in how water behaves under pressure.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When the massive 75-foot gorge broke at Turkey Hill upriver, the unfathomable mass of water and ice bore down on Safe Harbor. But the crucial failure wasn't just the main river overflowing its banks.
What was it?
The catastrophic failure centered on the Stone Arch Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge that crossed the Conestoga River right at the point where it met the Susquehanna.
The invincible stone bridge we talked about earlier, the one designed with massive compressive strength.
Right. Historically, this strong stone bridge had acted as a protective barrier for the town. It stood as a wall against the ice and had successfully helped break the force of other normal floods.
Like a shield.
Exactly. But against the 1904 ice flow, it acted as a fatal, immovable dam. The millions of tons of ice jammed tightly against the arches of the bridge, completely blocking the channel.
And the water has nowhere to go?
The water backed up. The hydrostatic pressure we discussed built to a catastrophic level behind it.
Waiting for something to give.
And when it finally gave way, the engineering failed exactly how we discussed. The upward and lateral pressure was too much. The contemporary reports say the massive Stone Arch Railroad Bridge was, quote, hoisted up like a tinker toy and dropped in the water, a tangled mess.
Hoisted up like a tinker toy. Just think about the weight of a Stone Arch Railroad Bridge. Thousands and thousands of tons of quarried stone.
Unimaginable weight.
And the ice just lifted it from below like a child's toy.
And here's where the fluid dynamics become truly terrifying. When that barrier broke, the water didn't just flow downstream into the Susquehanna.
Where did it go?
The main river was already so choked with ice and water that the path of least resistance was actually backward. It created what is known as a backwater bore. It released an awful, highly concentrated volume of water and ice up the creek.
Oh my God.
It was essentially a localized tsunami moving in the wrong direction, rushing straight up the Conestoga River Valley and immediately covering the town of Safe Harbor.
And once again, we have to emphasize the terrifying, impossible speed of this event.
It was so fast.
The flood did all of its work. Its total complete annihilation of the town in just 15 minutes.
15 minutes to destroy a town.
In a quarter of an hour, the water rose nearly 40 feet on the opposite side of the Conestoga. It invaded the second floor of John E. Hare's Exchange Hotel, which was supposed to be built on perfectly safe high ground.
High ground meant nothing.
Nothing. The ice and water together crushed, mutilated, and moved almost every single building in the place entirely off its foundation.
It is genuinely hard for the human brain to comprehend that level of geographical change in 15 minutes. To really ground you in what this felt like, we have to move away from the engineering and look at the human experience.
We really do.
The historical records provide some harrowing, incredibly specific stories of the villagers who lived through those 15 minutes.
Yes, these personal stories are what make the statistics real. Take H.M. Stauffer.
Right.
He was a successful coal and timber dealer in town. His firm's office and massive warehouse were ruined instantly. But his personal escape is the stuff of nightmares.
What happened to him?
The flood came on so fast, rushing up the creek, that his family barely had time to sprint from their house. Mr. Stauffer was the last to leave. By the time he was running for the hills, the water had already overtaken him.
He was moving that fast.
Yes. He was wading through freezing, rushing water up to his neck to reach the safety of the hillside.
Up to his neck.
And behind him, his $5,000 home, which was an absolute fortune in 1904, was completely wrecked.
And then there's the story of Benjamin Lawyer. The water rose so fast in his section of town that he couldn't even run. He took refuge on the roof of his house.
On the roof.
I want you to imagine sitting on your pitched roof, surrounded by churning, freezing black water and giant blocks of ice grinding violently against the wooden walls of your home.
Threatening to pull the entire structure down into the abyss at any second.
He was eventually rescued by two local men, John Rainier and Benjamin Markley, who commandeered a frail rowboat and actively dodged giant moving ice blocks to get to him.
They took a rowboat into that.
Yeah. The reporters on the ground noted they were in momentary danger of having their frail craft crushed in the ice.
Wow. You also have the deeply vulnerable people who couldn't save themselves. Mrs. A.G. Hudson was completely bedridden.
She was sick.
She was severely ill with pneumonia when the ice flood hit. Can you imagine the terror? Hearing the roaring, seeing the water rushing under your door, and being physically unable to stand.
That is horrific.
She had to be rescued and physically carried out at incredible risk by her neighbors. It wasn't just healthy men running. It was the sick, the elderly, being dragged from the jaws of this ice monster by their community.
And the desperation extended to the livestock, which represented the livelihood of these people. Lundy Hutchinson, the local postmaster whose house was heavily damaged, had several valuable cows trapped in a stable.
Oh, no.
The water was rising too fast to open the doors and lead them out. They would have drowned instantly.
So what did they do?
So in a stroke of sheer panicked ingenuity, they literally took axes, cut a massive hole in the roof of the stable, and hoisted the heavy cows out one by one with thick ropes.
Pulling cows through a roof in the middle of an apocalyptic ice flood, the sheer desperation of that act tells you everything you need to know about what those 15 minutes were like.
And the aftermath for the town of Safe Harbor is a grim, permanent conclusion. 79 houses built along the Conestoga were smothered in ice and water.
Smothered.
Dozens of houses were completely hidden in an ocean of ice blocks, some of the blocks as big as the houses themselves. Most of the structures were crushed into literal firewood.
And the town itself.
The damage was so absolute, so complete, that the town simply could not mathematically or economically recover. The iron company surveyed the damage and abandoned what the water didn't wash away.
All the massive ironwork buildings were razed to the ground around 1907. And a few years later, in 1913, the hopelessly damaged homes of Safe Harbor Village were sold off for salvage.
Do you know how much they sold for?
Just $30 apiece. That was the end of the Safe Harbor Ironworks and its bustling, boozy, lively town. It was abandoned to the trees and the brush.
It is a profound lesson in impermanence. The things we build, no matter how sturdy we believe them to be, exist purely at the mercy of the landscape.
Absolutely.
But the story doesn't end when the water stops rising, because the immediate terror of the water receding gave way to a completely different, almost more insurmountable problem.
What was that?
They didn't just have mud to clean up. They had a geographical anomaly to deal with.
Right, because with a normal flood, the water goes down, you shovel the mud out of your living room, you dry out the rugs, and you rebuild. But an ice jam flood leaves behind a landscape buried in ice, blocks the size of houses. You are left with a temporary freezing glacier sitting exactly where your town and your infrastructure used to be.
A literal glacier.
The journalists noted that even after the water receded, the vast, jagged field of ice remained, and the locals knew it would require weeks of milder weather before it even began to melt.
And the infrastructure paralysis this caused was staggering, particularly for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the economic lifeblood of the entire region.
The supply chain.
Think of the railroad in 1904 as the Amazon supply chain of its day. We talked about the tracks being hidden. They weren't just wet. They were buried under 10 to 50 feet of packed ice, the splintered wreckage of buildings, masses of rock, earth, and tangled telegraph poles.
So they couldn't run trains at all.
The tracks were completely, utterly useless for about a week.
And the economic ripple effect of severing that artery is massive. Freight trains were entirely paralyzed. Coal wasn't moving. Food wasn't moving.
Everything stopped.
The blockade caused immense freight congestion all the way up in Harrisburg. And the passenger trains, they had to be forced onto crazy multi-hour detours.
Just to get around the glacier.
Yeah, they were running trains over the Reading tracks to Lebanon, then over the Cornwall Road to Conewago, just doing these massive looping, highly inefficient bypasses to get people to Philadelphia or Baltimore because the main line was buried.
To fix this, the railroad had to mobilize what can only be described as a civilian cleanup army. The labor statistics required to chip away this glacier are staggering.
How many men?
The railroad hired between 3,000 and 4,000 men to clear the tracks by hand.
By hand. And this wasn't just local farmers with shovels. They brought in 1,600 Italian laborers employed under H.S. Kerbau and Company who had been working on massive railroad construction projects in York County.
Right.
They literally pulled these men off their construction crews and sent them to war against the ice. And the work is brutally physical.
It's basically mining.
They are using heavy iron pickaxes and shovels to physically chip their way through miles of compacted ice that is up to 30 feet deep in spots. It was described in the papers as the biggest job of house cleaning that the company has ever undertaken.
Let's contextualize the economics of that labor, too. The compensation for this back-breaking, freezing, highly dangerous work. They were paid 20 cents an hour.
20 cents.
To keep the men working around the clock, the railroad also furnished their board, free of cost, bringing in entirely new boxcars to act as makeshift sleeping quarters and establishing a dedicated commissary train just to feed the thousands of workers.
Wow.
They also brought in 6 massive steam shovels to attack the ice, treating it like a mining operation.
20 cents an hour to swing a pickaxe into a glacier. It really puts the harsh reality of the era into perspective.
It sure does.
And the local hardware stores in Columbia completely sold out of every single shovel and crowbar they had in stock. It was an all-hands-on-deck, desperate fight against frozen water.
While the laborers were fighting the ice on the railroad tracks, there were fascinating side stories occurring in the towns that survived, showing how the ice crippled everyday life in completely unexpected ways.
Yeah, the secondary disasters.
The interconnectedness of early 20th century infrastructure became a huge vulnerability. The situation in Marietta is a perfect example of how brittle these new technological systems really were.
Oh, Marietta's double whammy. I couldn't stop thinking about this when I read it. So Marietta survived the main devastating surge of the flood.
Barely, but yes.
But the crushing, shifting fields of ice offshore in the river sprang a massive leak in the main river pipe of the town's waterworks.
The ice just broke it.
The freezing, warping ice physically crushed and disabled the intake pipes entirely. So suddenly the town has absolutely no running water.
Which is a severe crisis on its own.
Right.
But here's the technological domino effect. The brand new electric light plant in Marietta depended entirely on that specific river water to supply its steam boilers to generate the town's power.
So the exact moment the water pipes break, the boilers run dry, they start producing steam, and the electricity cuts out.
Yep.
The town simultaneously loses its water supply and its power grid. I want you to put yourself in their shoes for a second. You have just survived the most terrifying natural disaster of your life.
The stilling shock.
The river outside your door is a churning, roaring nightmare of house-sized ice blocks. The temperature's freezing, and suddenly your electric lights go out and your taps run completely dry.
You are plunged into freezing, absolute darkness.
With nothing to drink and no way to heat your home.
It is the ultimate feeling of helplessness. It highlights perfectly how fragile our technological comforts really are when the foundational natural systems they rely on are disrupted by a force we cannot control.
Because they took it for granted.
The engineers built the electric plant assuming the water would always flow. The ice proved that assumption false.
So, after looking at all of this, the destruction, the bridges snapping like tinker toys, the towns being erased, and the 20-cent an hour laborers fighting glaciers, what is the ultimate takeaway here? What does this teach us about our relationship with the built environment?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1904 flood serves as a phenomenal, undeniable demonstration of the absolute limits of human engineering against natural thermodynamic forces.
Nature always wins.
The engineers of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the York Haven Dam were not foolish men. They were the brightest minds of their generation. They built with heavy, quarried stone and solid forged steel.
They did their best.
They built structures they honestly, truly thought were invincible, but they were designing for the predictable mean, not the catastrophic anomaly.
They designed for an average spring shower.
Exactly. They treated the river as a variable they had completely solved.
Yeah.
The ice jam proved that the river was a force they had merely borrowed time from. When millions of tons of ice are driven by the hydrostatic pressure of a swollen river basin, human engineering is treated like literal toys. It is a profound lesson in the absolute necessity of humility in civil engineering.
Humility is exactly the right word. But amid all this destruction, amid the 10-foot in 5-minute water rises, the millions of dollars lost, the 79 homes smothered in safe harbor.
Yeah.
There is something I found in the sources that I had to read 3 times because I fundamentally didn't believe it. It is the most shocking fact of this entire deep dive. The great miracle of 1904.
It truly defies logic given the parameters of the disaster we've just discussed.
Despite the absolute total erasure of towns, despite people wading through neck-deep freezing water and cows being pulled through roofs, despite buildings being ground to dust, there was no loss of life reported in these events.
None.
0. None. Not a single person died. I need you to explain this to me. How is that physically possible?
It's hard to believe.
When water rises 40 feet in 15 minutes, people die. That is the tragic rule of floods. We see it today even with modern technology. How did they survive in 1904?
The answer is profound, and it points directly to the strength and sociology of the early 20th century community.
Okay, tell me.
When you look at the historical texts from the Lancaster New Era, they detail exactly how it happened. In 1904, they didn't have early warning sirens, they didn't have push notifications on a weather app, and they didn't have immediate government intervention or helicopters.
Right, they had nothing.
They had the neighbors. The text specifically notes that the cry of warning was quickly passed from house to house.
It was a human, physical chain of communication.
Exactly. Because people lived in such close proximity and relied on each other daily, their situational awareness was linked.
They paid attention.
When the ice first started moving, when the very first cracking sounds and signs of danger were observed, people didn't just grab their own belongings, lock their doors, and run.
They warned each other.
They ran to the next house. They banged on doors. Men, women, and children hurried through the freezing slush and rising water, passing the warning verbally, pulling each other toward the safety of the hills.
It's the ultimate contrast to the hubris of the engineering. Benjamin Lawyer was rescued from his roof by 2 men who risked their own lives in a frail boat.
Right.
Mrs. Hudson was carried out of her sickbed by her neighbors.
Oh.
It was a triumph of human communication and community care.
Precisely. When the rigid, arrogant structures failed them, when the invincible stone bridges collapsed and the telegraph wires were ripped down, the flexible, highly adaptable community safety net caught them.
That's beautiful.
The sources talk extensively about how the people who made it to the hills immediately took in the homeless. In Middletown alone, there were 400 families suddenly homeless, their houses completely wrecked by the ice.
400 families.
They were huddled in churches, schoolhouses, market houses, and public halls. The people who lived on the high ground opened their farmhouses, shared their winter food stores, and provided warmth.
The engineering failed because it was rigid and couldn't adapt to the pressure. The people survived because they were incredibly adaptable, communicative, and felt a profound duty to care for one another.
It's an incredible realization.
We started this deep dive with the serene image of horse-drawn wagons casually crossing a frozen river, treating a 2-foot-thick sheet of ice as a convenient highway.
And we saw how fast that changed.
We tracked the science of how a simple change in temperature, a spring thaw, weaponized that ice into a 75-foot-high, grinding, roaring monster.
Backwater bore.
We learned how hydrostatic pressure and lateral kinetic force snapped massive stone bridges like Tinker Toys and scoured the village of Collins off the literal face of the map.
Grounded away.
We watched millions of dollars of industrial progress get battered into submission, and we explored the economic paralysis that required an army of laborers to pickaxe their way through 30-foot deep ice jams for 20 cents an hour.
And left towns like Marietta in the dark.
Most importantly, we saw how quickly the physics of nature can completely rewrite the geography of our world.
And yet, through all of that thermodynamic violence, the human element, the neighbors banging on doors, passing the warning, saving the sick, hoisting the livestock to safety, remains the most enduring, miraculous triumph of the story.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your curiosity about the past is exactly what keeps these vital lessons alive.
It really is.
History is so full of these explosive, dramatic, forgotten moments that are quite literally hiding right beneath our feet. Today, if you visit the area, there's a short, peaceful walking trail, exactly where the bustling, boozy village of Safe Harbor used to be.
just a trail now.
You can walk right over the scattered rocks from the old foundations, the few stones that survived the crushing weight of the ice. It looks incredibly peaceful now, but as you know, it has a terrifying story to tell about what happens when water decides to take the land back.
And as we close, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over. In 1904, the smartest engineers in the country built their railroad bridges out of massive stone and forged steel, entirely supremely confident that they could withstand anything nature threw at them.
And they were wrong.
They had to stand on the hills and watch those invincible structures be hoisted up and crushed in 15 minutes by a kinetic force they vastly underestimated. As you look around at the unbreakable infrastructure of our modern world today, our massive concrete dams, our highly delicate climate-controlled data centers, our sprawling, deeply interconnected power grids, ask yourself, what is the modern equivalent of that hidden ice champ? What is the unimaginable compound force of nature we are completely underestimating right now?
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.